election rumor research, political social media, polarization, and a variety of topics related to tonight's State of Trust conversation. Tonight's content will center around statewide polling conducted by Survey USA in partnership with the Seattle Times, King 5 News, and the CIP. Our guests will explore what the results might tell us about how Washingtonians feel going into the elections. Hanson has also designed tonight's program with the key themes from questions that you, our audience, submitted prior. We'll also have the opportunity for you to ask additional questions during and following the presentation. Please submit those using the Q&A feature at any time, and we will get to as many as time allows. Without further ado, I'm pleased to turn this over to Hanson to get our evening started. Thank you, Hanson.
Thank you, Courtney. And welcome everyone to State of Trust, Washington's political climate and voter priorities. So given the billing for this event and the nature of our two guests' expertise, we're going to tell a tale of two Washingtons this evening. That's because there's this interesting interplay between our Washington and the other one in the District of Columbia. As we'll hear this evening, the national discourse is informing our state one to a certain degree, and vice versa, perhaps. As we look at the state of democracy in Washington state, does it hint at all at the state of democracy nationally? Especially as we know that Washington is not a traditional swing state. So given this duality, here's how we'll proceed. First, we'll ask Claire from the Seattle Times to unpack the polls as they relate to Washington state races and ballot initiatives. Then we'll focus on Daniel's expertise at the Center for an Informed Public as she looks more nationally at the results as they concern trust in our democratic systems. Let's begin by looking at a few slides from the poll results that are of interest to Claire. So we're going to put those up right now and we'll just talk that through. So this is based on the question, which of the two candidates running for governor, Dave Reichert or Bob Ferguson, do you trust more to improve the following issues? And you see the issues right there: public safety, the economy, education, affordable housing, and reproductive rights. Let's go to the next slide. So on public safety, you see the results here. 67% Republicans think it's Reichert. Ferguson is 12% Republicans, 80% Democrats, and then we have the undecided. So you can see the split that's happening along party lines with independents as well. And I believe that as we look at the global figures, if we add those all up without doing the partisan split, that it is 48% that say they trust Ferguson more in public safety and 34% say they trust Reichert, which is also interesting in itself. Next slide, please. And on the economy, we see, once again, this interesting partisan split with 63% Republicans for Reichert, 8% Democrats. And you can see how they're lining up for Ferguson as well. And then on the undecided. Next slide. Education. So 62% Republicans for Reichert, 83% Democrats for Ferguson. There's very much a party line thing happening here. And you can see the independents are sort of carrying it down the middle. And next. Affordable housing. So 62% Republicans, 6% Democrats for Reichert, 13% Republicans, 83% Democrats for Ferguson, and the undecided there. And finally, I think the last issue. Oh, so this, and then here's another question then. Which statement is most close to your opinion? The Washington state government is responsible with our tax dollars. The Washington state government wastes some of our tax dollars. And the Washington state government wastes a lot of our tax dollars. So let's see the results. Next slide. And here they are. Responsible with our tax dollars, 9% Republicans, 41% Democrats, 12% independents. Waste some of our tax dollars. It begins to even out a bit there, 31, 36, 37. Waste a lot of our tax dollars. That's where we begin to really see the split, 51% Republicans, 41% independents, and then 14% Democrats. And then you got the not sure. Next slide. This could be our last slide. That's our last slide. So Claire, we've gone through some interesting statistics from the poll results there. Anything particularly striking for you with regards to sort of either partisan splits or a level of trust currently in Washington state as we are 2 weeks out from the election?
Yeah, I mean, I think you noted correctly that in a lot of these cases, there is a pretty strong partisan split on how you feel about Bob Ferguson and how you feel about Dave Reichert. I think it corresponds in general with the growth of political polarization and sort of the decline of ticket splitting. it is much more common to kind of vote consistently with the party you most identify with. It is interesting to see, compared to the primary election results, that the gap between Reichert and Ferguson has stayed pretty consistent. And it'll be interesting to see what happens in the general election, given that there has been some tension sort of within the state's Republicans about the choice of Reichert, who's a little bit more moderate than the other Republican, one of the other Republican candidates for governor, Semi Bird, who is a little bit more further right leaning.
And you've been covering Washington state politics for the last 2 years, and then Oregon for the last 4 before that. So 6 years here on the left coast. From your perception and from your own experience, Washington state is very much considered a progressive state, regardless of some of these partisan splits from what you're seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's definitely moving in a more progressive direction. I cover the state legislature where Democrats have steadily been growing their majorities and are poised potentially to have a supermajority in the upcoming state election, meaning there would be so many of them that they'd be able to make more policy decisions more quickly without needing to necessarily get the input or the approval of the opposite party. And Democrats have sort of held a trifecta in Washington, meaning they hold the state house, the state senate, and the governor's mansion, and have done so since late 2017.
And that's interesting in itself because obviously the topic of tonight is trust and also the state of our democracy. And here in Washington state, the one Washington we'll be talking about, and then we'll talk about the other one later, we are currently in a one-party state for all purposes and intents. And based on what you're seeing right now with these polls, that doesn't look like it's going to change. And so because of that, it's what I find most interesting, and I have my envelope ready to go for voting. We've got these ballot initiatives that maybe are also specific to Washington state's political system as perhaps a counterbalance to what is going on in the state house with regards to that one-party rule. What's your observations about the ballot initiatives presently, especially as they relate to the poll results?
Yeah, as a reporter, it's a really fascinating time to be covering Washington state politics because so often we're covering politicians and what they're saying. But with these ballot initiatives, we're talking a lot about public policy and sort of what direction Washington should be going in some of these pretty critical policy areas. How do we care for the elderly? Should we tax capital gains? Should we have a carbon market? And they were sort of brought by a hedge fund manager from Redmond who is sort of unhappy with the direction of economic policies, primarily in Washington, managed to get a few voter initiatives actually through the legislative process during this year's session. And now these 4 other initiatives are getting presented directly to voters. And it's sort of a way when Democrats are sort of in charge of the legislative process for folks who may not agree with that line of thinking to gather voter support and sort of challenge these ideas in sort of a broader court.
So rather than see these ballot initiatives as wholly partisan, there is a certain indication that perhaps it speaks to the health of our democracy in Washington state, that if you've got one part that might seem imbalanced, that at least we have this checks and balances where people can bring this particular initiative if they don't agree with what's going on in Olympia.
Yeah, and it's definitely how sort of the folks supporting these initiatives are portraying it, saying, the Democrats are going too far. And it'll be really interesting to see whether voters agree, because if they do agree, the legislature may have to sort of adapt to that mandate from voters.
But what we've seen so far from this particular poll is that these ballot initiatives probably aren't going to succeed. And it's the ballot initiatives themselves are worded really interestingly because you have to essentially say yes if you want to get rid of the existing laws and no if you want to keep them. And so it's confusing in itself.
Yeah, I think it is confusing for a lot of voters, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum. I think, in typical conversation, you're not talking in the way that our ballot titles are phrased. And I think Survey USA, who conducted the poll, noted that sort of construction is a little confusing for people. The idea that if you're voting yes for something, you're actually voting against a concept or an idea. Whereas if you're voting no, you're voting to sort of keep the status quo. I am curious like how much that confusion plays into the level of indecision on some of these ballot measures. I'm curious, where people are going for information about the ballot measures, and then sort of what will happen on election night if the level of voter participation in these initiatives is going to be lower than the participation in voting for president or governor.
That's a really good observation. Now, Claire, we've indicated that you have, great expertise as a political reporter in the Pacific Northwest, and there's that traditional divide that we see with the mountain range, the Cascades. On one side, you got Republicans, the other side, Democrats, and we're seeing some of that partisanship and some of the results that we've had with the poll. Have you also seen any particular shift in geography and those demographics that might indicate that this election might not be the same as what we've seen in the last few years, or is it very much status quo?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think one of the really big sort of factors, at least on the state level this year, and looking at the state legislature, is that there were several districts in Washington that had to be redrawn after a court decision surrounding the Voting Rights Act and access to the ballot for Latinos in Washington. And given the way that the new boundaries are drawn, there is some indication that some of these central Washington districts, which have been held by Republicans for a long time, could actually shift toward Democrats, and that those districts could play a role in building that Democratic supermajority. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there.
Yeah, that's an interesting development, and I guess that speaks one way or the other to the integrity of the electoral system here in Washington State. And we'll be coming to Danielle in a second to be speaking about that more nationally. But if you had to qualify, at least based on your experience and observations for the last 6 years, how would you what would you how would you speak to the integrity of the electoral system here in Washington State? As we have mail-in ballots, we definitely have clear divides. We have a very progressive state, generally speaking, with regards to results. Is it a system that we can trust?
Yeah, I mean, Washington has had mail-in voting statewide since 2011, and many counties had already adopted that system. And I think that there broadly is a lot of trust in the system because Washingtonians are sort of used to mail-in voting and know how the process works. It will be interesting to see sort of whether that holds in a second election where you have, or a third election rather, where you have sort of Trump at the top of the ticket and sort of these questions around voter integrity or ballot integrity. But I am seeing like a lot of nationally early returns coming in, and in some states breaking records. And some of that is driven by Republicans who Trump has instructed, like, get your ballots in early. In Washington specifically, I think a good example of the integrity of the system is there was a very, very close race for state lands commissioner in the primary, and I think will continue to be a close race in the general, but they had to do a hand recount. And so we'll see what the results hold, but so far there's a lawsuit over the process as well. I think maybe the real answer to this question is sort of, it depends on who you ask. But I think for the most part, Washingtonians have adjusted to a vote by mail system.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And my final question for you before we go to Danielle is, you referenced Trump, and there's obviously what has been resonating a lot in the national discourse with Republicans and with former President Trump has been a hot topic issue of immigration. And the poll results that we have here do indicate that certain people, if they think immigration in Washington State is a problem, then they are going to vote in one way or the other in terms of the other things. And so, from your reporting, how much have you seen a subject such as immigration be of any major issue in Washington State so far?
Yeah, I think the old saying that all politics is local has definitely been replaced by all politics is national. I definitely see that when I'm talking to politicians, when I'm talking to voters. Another issue where that's come up is abortion. After the fall of Roe, state legislators here advanced a lot of policies that were meant to sort of secure and even advance abortion rights in the state as sort of a counterweight to what is happening nationally. But that's absolutely the case. The national discourse is really filtering down to the state level.
Well, we didn't plan it this way, but that's an excellent segue to Danielle in terms of going from one Washington to the other. So Claire, thank you very much for this. We'll come back to you in a few minutes, and we'll now move to Danielle, and we'll start with some slides in terms of subjects that are important and interesting to her expertise. So let's put up those slides now. So this is the question from the WAPOL. How concerned are you about each of the following things? And this is the subject that we'll be tackling with Danielle. Non-citizens illegally voting in U.S. elections. And here we see 29% very concerned, 17% somewhat concerned, 22% not very concerned, 25% not concerned, and 7% not sure. And obviously I don't think we've asked this kind of question a few years ago, so we don't have much of a gauge in terms of whether this is something has changed a lot in the last few years, but it's interesting to see that split. And if you do go look into the more granular results in terms of folks who might support the Republican Party versus the Democrat Party, you can align them with their level of concern. So that's one slide. The next one, please. And how often do you think that non-citizens illegally vote in U.S. elections? Regularly, occasionally, or almost never? 25% regularly, 24% occasionally, 37% almost never, and 14% not sure. I believe those are the only two slides for Danielle, so let's bring her here. Danielle, it's nice to chat with you after speak. Oh, there's one more. Okay, before I jump the gun. Has your level of trust in Washington's vote by mail system increased, decreased, or stayed the same since the 2020 presidential election? Increased 15%, 32% Democrats, 10% independents, decreased 43% Republicans, 3% Democrats, stayed the same, 38% Republicans, 62 Democrats, 59% independents, and not sure. So that is of note for our conversation. Danielle, it's nice to have you here as well. I've had a long-standing relationship with the Center for the Informed Public over the last 5 years. So to dive into this topic with you is wonderful. What are your immediate observations from those three slides with regards to trust and integrity in the electoral system generally, especially as you look at it from the point of view of federally in Washington, D.C.?
Absolutely. First of all, thank you so much for having me tonight. It's great to speak with all of you. So yeah, non-citizen voting and mail-in ballots. I think when we think about some of the issues of the rumors that my team has been tracking that have been emerging in this election cycle, one of the predominant deep stories, if you will, is that there are large swaths of non-citizen voters voting regularly in elections. Now, this is not true. Non-citizen voting is a felony. It's incredibly rare. And yet there are examples of folks, we see a lot of rumors and also a lot of what we call like evidence generation around non-citizen voting, which is basically images, data, videos, or even lawsuits kind of taken out of context to evidence a claim. So for instance, we earlier in this year, we saw videos online of man on the street interviews at the southern border, interviewing migrants who were crossing, asking them who they were planning to vote for in this election. It's kind of like a gotcha question, a little bit of a trap, but these videos get taken out of context and used to say, look, I saw it with my own eyes. This person is planning to vote for Biden or whatever have you. And then we saw it again recently with voter roll purges in states like Virginia or Ohio, with allegations that there were mass numbers of non-citizen voters on the rolls. But this was also, again, taken a little out of context. First of all, that's the voter rolls getting cleaned up just as they should before an election. Second of all, it could be flagging someone in a system who is a non-citizen, getting a license at the DMV, and then getting flagged because maybe they were automatically enrolled into a system, and that's just the system cleaning itself up, which is kind of the case that happened. And then thirdly, you'll see there are examples, very rare, of non-citizens voting. And just today we saw some prosecutions for this of 6 people in Ohio. Now, again, like these are very rare instances, but when there's a constant drumbeat of conversations in certain echo chambers or certain media sources, it can become a national narrative and a sort of meta explanation for if, you know, the election goes one way or another, it could be pointed to. And I'd say it's why we have those three slides rather, the about non-citizen voting and then also about mail-in ballots, because in 2020, the sort of meta story there was about the security or alleged insecurity of mail-in ballots. So if you could sort of make a sort of comparison, 2020 is to mail-in ballots as 2024 is to non-citizen voting.
Well, yeah, well, that was great in terms of giving us a really good lay of the land of what's happening with regards to, I guess, perceived trust to the electoral system nationally. And you heard us with Claire going through some of the figures with regards to Washington State. When you see this, what you call the drumbeat around the conversation around non-citizens voting and as well as mail-in ballots, with regards to Washington State, as you look at it in terms of the federal landscape, is there anything surprising about Washington State, or is it tracking pretty much with what's happening in the rest of the country from what you've seen so far?
I mean, what I find interesting, not a native Washingtonian myself, but what I find interesting is that you do have pretty strong trust in your mail-in voting here, in part because you've just had it longer than a lot of other folks in the country. So in 2020, as a result of the pandemic, there were a lot of last-minute changes to processes and procedures to make sure that folks could vote given the health risks at the time. And so I think anytime you have something new in a highly uncertain moment, like a democratic election, and it's good our democratic elections are uncertain, like it means they're not, guaranteed to go one way or the other, even if maybe in Washington State you have more predictable outcomes than perhaps a national election where the margins are razor thin right now. So I think that it's really interesting when, yeah, you do have this different trust, but we did see in that WA poll from July as compared to 2022, in 2 years, the decrease in trust in mail-in ballots, particularly amongst Republicans. And I think that does have something to do with the national discourse around election integrity, particularly in Republican circles.
Yeah, that definitely has happened. And so, as you do your own research, I mean, you were quoted just yesterday in a CNN article. What are you looking for most when it comes to tracking these rumors? I mean, if there's a certain intensity occurring, where's it coming from, or is it just happening in, sporadic, random pockets? You just try to whack-a-mole as they come up.
Yeah. So the thing that we want to highlight is that rumoring is a natural human phenomenon. Anytime you have something new or uncertain, like in a breaking news event, like the Trump assassination attempts, for instance, or a disaster like the hurricanes that recently hit the American Southeast. Or a democratic election, you're going to have a lot of people trying to do what we call collective sense making, which is essentially get evidence of like what's happening, and then there might be other folks who are framing that and trying to explain that to, in some ways, assuage our anxiety about what's going on out there. And so I'd say rumors can be true, they can be false, but usually there's somewhere in between. There's like a kernel of something there. That's why maybe sometimes fact checking right away doesn't really tell you the whole truth about what's going on. So anyways, when we're looking for rumors, we are interested at the center, and my team that I manage is rumors related to election processes and procedures. So that's political stuff, less so, like that's not our remit. We're interested in these kinds of rumors. And oftentimes, we caught a couple of weeks ago, we put it on our Substack, an example where there were some errors in on ballots, the spelling of Tim Walz's name on a Florida ballot, leaving someone off, Kamala Harris off on a ballot in Montana. And these were just mistakes that were immediately fixed, like within hours. And there was some chatter about these things, but those kinds of things don't really take off. It's the stuff that it doesn't necessarily can be proven false or true immediately that kind of sticks around, particularly when it's matching a larger national narrative or explanation for something going on that may have a political kind of story or incentive, depending on different stakeholder groups, because we see rumoring happen across the political spectrum.
Well, given that this is your full-time job, which is actually monitoring election rumors about the system, how potentially damaging or even fatal is it to our system, having these rumors? Because one of the statistics, one of the poll results we did not show on a slide was that 43% believe that our democracy in Washington state, these are Washingtonians, believe that our democracy is weakening on the point of collapse. And so there's a lot of negativity right now about democracy. How much does rumoring feed into those negative sentiments?
Well, it's hard to make a precise causal claim here because there's so many dynamics in social science and information science and just media studies as well. So, but we can talk about certain variables, right, that could be contributing to this phenomenon of maybe lower trust in democracy or in elections. One thing that is, when I was listening to Claire's observations and also more broadly about Washington state electoral system, and comparing it to the other Washington or, DC, national, federal politics, I think Gallup had a poll earlier in September that said 84% of Dems versus 28% of Republicans had faith in the vote nationally. And so that's like a pretty stark difference, right? And I think when, two players or two teams are playing the same game and one is has such mistrust in that process that they're willing to contest it in certain ways, it makes the other team also think, well, if they don't trust it, maybe they're going to play dirty, and then that team thinks the other team is playing dirty, and the rules of engagement sort of change and cause this feeling of mistrust, not just in the electoral system, but in each other. And that's a larger conversation about democracy and democratic culture that we could have.
It sounds like a mind virus. Like one catches it, and they spread it to the others because we all start thinking the same way. So I can see how that can happen. The other, and we'll come to Claire in a second, just to bring us both into conversation. The other poll result was confidence in state courts versus federal courts or the Supreme Court to adjudicate a dispute if there's any problems with the electoral results. And there seems to be a bit more confidence in the state courts than there are with the Supreme Court and the federal courts in Washington state. What does that tell you about Washington state generally in relation to the rest of the country, despite some of the observations you made already about the drop in trust in the mail-in ballot system?
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, trust and mistrust are not like the inverse of each other. Once you lose trust, sometimes it's really hard to gain that back. But when you have trust, you kind of have to maintain it. And I think my impression of state politics here is it hasn't been the conversation of some sort of politicized judicial activism in the same way the Supreme Court has been. And also, if you look at the polls, it's like state has a strong degree of trust, and then more federal judges, and then like a much larger drop off between even federal and the Supreme Court. And that also tells you something because of the politicization and like the very highly visible Supreme Court sorry, I'm blanking on the term, confirmations
Yeah.
that happened under the Trump administration. I think that might have something to do with it, because I think when you also think about rumors and conversation online and narratives, it oftentimes helps to have some kind of video or image or some sort of evidence that you can share that helps you make a claim as opposed to just making that on your own. And when you have very visible things like a confirmation hearing, that was the word I was looking for, of Supreme Court justices like that, and the high visibility of the politicization of that, it could have something to do with that. And also I'd say maybe it has something to do with the repeal of Roe v. Wade as well.
That's right. In fact, abortion was one of the questions that came up in the polling results as well. So that's a worthwhile remark. So let's bring Claire back to the conversation so the three of us can just chat for a little bit before we go to your questions. Claire, you've heard Danielle's calm voice of reason with regards to the national landscape and electoral trust. We've got 2 weeks left before the election, and you've already made some great observations from the poll results about what's happening the same and different in Washington State presently. But what, if anything, do you anticipate potentially changing between now and November 5th in the state?
Gosh, I don't know. It's like hard for me to make predictions. I imagine that voters are going to be bombarded with a lot more information from campaigns, and that information could move the needle as far as the number of undecided voters on a certain candidate or on a certain initiative topic. I'll be really interested to see what turnout looks like, especially now that Kamala Harris is the Democratic nominee. So I think there are a lot of interesting things to look out for, but I'm a little cautious to say how things
I
could
understand.
change.
Yeah, I imagine. I mean, in terms of the level of trust in the system, like, unless there is a huge amount of rumoring that's happening between now and then, I imagine things might stay fairly stable with regards to anxiety, at least here in Washington State, around the soundness of our electoral system.
Yeah, I
Danielle,
think that's
oh,
right.
sorry, go ahead, Claire. Yeah, just
Oh
give
no,
you
I
more
think you're
chances.
right. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry,
And
go ahead.
Danielle, as we think about the elections to come, let's just get beyond the next 2 weeks to the future. And we have remarked on what sets Washington State apart from the rest of the country with regards to mail-in ballots and just basically how we go about our own democracy here. Are there any takeaways from this state's electoral system that might be useful to instill more confidence in thinking about the integrity of our federal system or other state systems? In other words, are there any lessons that we can teach the rest of the country?
Um, it's a really good question. I would say, generally speaking, that you've done a great job, and with generally speaking, you've had mail-in voting for a long time, almost since 2005, as like an option enshrined in as one of the options to vote. And I think it shows folks like that there is a lot of ways of helping people be enfranchised without necessarily having this like massive amount of suspicion. And that is something to learn, to talk about that, to have a lot of communication about it, to do events like this. That are really trying to demystify some of what's going on and how elections are administered in the country. Because I think it has been in some ways a political strategy nationally to go after election administration, which is really hard. Unfortunately, some of the social science on trust and mistrust does indicate that once you lose trust, it is really hard to get back. So I would say sort of to Washington, like keep doing what you're doing in the sense of keep talking about it, asking those questions, being engaged with it. There's like high levels of participation here. And that will maintain your trust in your local democracy.
That's great. Yeah, demystifying transparency around the system itself and then engaging people so that they can feel like that the wool's not being pulled over their eyes, essentially. That sounds like a good set of lessons. So thanks for that. Claire, some questions coming from the audience. There's one specifically for you. From your reporting, how much attention are Washington state voters paying to the governor's race? Since right now, as we know, the presidential race is really driving so much media attention.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. There are about 16% undecided voters at this point. And so that's not huge, but it's also not insubstantial. I think in general, what I've observed is people pay less attention to what's happening in their state legislatures. Um, I I think there's just less of an understanding of that process and of the two chambers and things like that. However, I have seen sort of a rise in involvement and interest in state level politics since the Trump presidency. I think people started thinking about, well, if this is going on nationally, sort of observing the Republican playbook of acquiring power in state legislatures and in governors' mansions. I think Democrats started giving it sort of a similar focus. So that's been interesting to observe. But I would say on the whole, I think people are less familiar with the candidates for governor than they are with the candidates for president.
Yeah, I think that's a fair observation. Danielle, the way that we run elections in the United States is really complex, as we've already heard this evening, and it differs from state to state and from county to county. If we could somehow have a less complex system, do you think there'd be greater trust in how we vote, or do we just have to go about what you just said and just be more transparent, engage, and demystify?
We have partners or collaborators, like I should say, at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU's law school. And one of the things that I've learned in conversations with them when I have questions about how election administration works in other places, because there are, it's not just 50 states, it's thousands of different jurisdictions, thousands of different ballots in this country. And it's just like how decentralization is in some ways a form of security. That it's very hard to hack or rig an election because you would have to rig thousands of different ballots in the country. And I think like that is like if you did consolidate it and put it all under, one system, one set of laws, one way of adjudicating it, first of all, it might not appeal to the needs of each individual state and the geographic, social, demographic, all the different differences, cultural differences even of each state. But also, yeah, it is a form of security, actually. So another thing to consider.
Well, that's a compelling argument for complexity, and it gets back to what Claire and I were discussing earlier in terms of the ballot initiatives as yet another check and balance on the party system where people will get to put these initiatives out there. And Claire, we discussed this a little bit already, but I want to get back to it in terms of the particular ballot initiatives that we're looking at here in Washington State, in terms of the complexity of it and how it's been worded. And it seems that based on the poll data, a lot of people don't really understand what they're getting at. And I'm wondering, if that also speaks to our trust in the system, if there's either deliberate obfuscation in the wording of ballot initiatives such as that, or just making it far too complex for us to really knowingly vote one way or the other.
Yeah, I think that's definitely come up in the current election cycle where the initiatives, at least on the state level, have really been a focus of discourse. There's actually some controversy over the ballot language itself. The proponents of the initiatives don't like the fact that the statements now include a sentence about the effect of the initiatives on state funding for certain issues or areas. And that was actually a result of a law passed by majority Democrats in 2022. And those who support the initiative sort of look at that as, putting your thumb on the scale and saying, well, if we tell people that this measure would reduce funding for education, not a whole lot, like a minority of people want to reduce funding for education, and so that has definitely been a part of the conversation.
Yeah, I was telling my kids that these ballot initiatives are kind of like reading comprehension tests on the SAT, because you really have to pay very close attention to the wording and try to understand what are they truly asking you here.
Yeah, definitely. And a big part of my job is sort of translating a lot of this information into something that you could easily understand. Like if you think about these ballot titles, you're not going to turn to someone next to you and say, this measure would repeal or prohibit, like that's not how people
Yeah.
really talk. So trying to explain it in a way that's accessible is like a big part of my work.
Yeah, and I think that really gets to the idea that the more that we can simplify these things, the more that we might have trust in our democratic system, because we can all have a common understanding of what's being asked of us. Danielle, I've been telling a few people that I believe that this election in many ways is kind of like endgame, because not endgame in terms of the end of democracy or anything like that, but there's not just a political question to answer as we go into the end of this year, but also a technological one. We're seeing that artificial intelligence is really playing a major role in firming up how we will engage in the future, how we will work, and how we'll have our discourse perhaps regulated by machines as we try to cut off some of the fringes. And so I wonder whether in 2028 we'll still be, this is not me wondering, this is also a question from the audience, will we still be talking about what happened in 2024 election, or are we going to move on to a completely new reality with new issues and new concerns around electoral integrity and trust in our democracy? And we'll just put this all behind us.
Yeah, well, to repeat a very popular meme that emerged when Harris was nominated, we don't just fall out of a coconut tree, and we are part of the context that came before us. So I don't think that we are going to like divorce ourselves from history, from how technology moves and works and evolves. But I hear actually two things in that question. The first one is a question about AI and technology, and the second one is about like the importance of this election or also the 2020 election. And so the first thing I'd say, I get a lot of questions from journalists about, oh, what's the role of AI in this election? And I would say, in 2020 and in 2016, there were also questions, well, what was the role of Twitter? What was the role of Facebook? Or what was the role of X shiny new object? And I'd say these are very important tools. They definitely change certain kinds of dynamics for sure. But to say that AI is going to have this like massive persuasive effect, I don't know, the jury's still out on this, but I would venture to say that like the use of AI is much more mundane. It's like using AI to put Donald Trump in a Steelers jersey during his visit to a Pittsburgh Steelers game on Sunday, right? And that creates maybe like an ambient politics or a feeling of something. Maybe it persuades someone to feel like connected to that, like a sort of vibes-oriented approach to politics. But when it comes to some of the objectively false things, we saw examples of robocallers using a candidate's voice, giving object disinformation about like where and how to vote. Those kinds of uses of AI, like to deceive, can and have been prosecuted. So like the incentives to use AI in these really objectively and illegal, nefarious ways are lower. It's more for that other stuff that, we already have the capacity to make memes at scale, and to put a lot out there into the ecosystem. So I'd say that the use of AI, I would be more concerned about how that's being used in other fields necessarily than some sort of massive like duping persuasive effect. That's still out to be studied though, so we'll see. In terms of like the historicity of the moment of between, if in 2028 we're still going to be talking about 2024 or 2020, like absolutely, these are very important elections, and we've seen really there are some parts of it that are precedented and some parts that are not, and I'm sure we'll still be talking and studying it for years to come.
Well, you've set my mind at ease on the technology question. Thanks for that. And the use of historicity is a great way of looking at it. So thanks for that. Claire, I've been totally visualizing this mountain range that divides the state in terms of geography and as well in terms of party support and where they are on the issues. And this question might get to that a bit. How prevalent is ticket splitting these days in Washington state? In your reporting, have you seen much evidence that voters might embrace candidates from different parties?
I definitely think there is some of that. The thing I have learned over years of political reporting is that any individual voter's opinion is far more complex and nuanced than it may seem. You may have a lifelong Republican who supports abortion rights, which may seem unusual to us, but I think is more common than we think. And so I can say that objectively ticket splitting has gone down nationally based on like the data that I've looked at. So I think it is far less common. That's not to say it's not happening. But it will be interesting to look at the division between like who is supporting Trump versus Harris, who is supporting Ferguson versus Reichert. Do those margins line up, or is there some difference there, and what maybe could account for that? I could see a scenario where moderate Republicans in Washington are voting for Harris for president, but backing Reichert for governor, for example.
Yeah, I think that's a powerful observation, Claire, because it's a combination of policies and personalities that are in play here, both at the national and state level. While some people who might be traditional conservatives might have a challenge with some of the ways that Donald Trump goes about his discourse and say, well, I want to go this way. So there may be some shifting going along, but we really won't know until November 5th and we see how this all plays out. But there's some indication, I think, at least nationally, that there's alliances might moving because of the various personalities and the sharpness of the policies in play. Um, Danielle, this comes back to your rumor monitoring. What's the most surprising or troubling rumor or conspiracy theory about voting in the election that you've seen pop up and perhaps has some staying power?
Um, you know, we see a lot of things, and I would say I would point to a recent piece, two things that we did. Um, we did a recent piece last week or the week before. What is time? I don't know. But it was about a hurricane disinformation and rumors about the hurricane. And I think Kate Starbird, the co-founder of the Center for an Informed Public, did a lot of her early research on, crisis events. So we're very much informed by the ways in which mis and disinformation and rumors emerge in these kinds of moments, and seeing the ways in which there were quite conspiratorial narratives saying, well, because this hurricane ripped through North Carolina, a swing state, right when it was already delayed and having its ballots get out because of an RFK contestation on the ballots there, and seeing rumors that said, well, they are controlling the weather. This is weather manipulation. And I'm not talking of the climate change type, but like there are people who are fabricating or have the capacity to like make a hurricane.
They have a weather machine, right, to
Oh,
generate and to aim.
I suppose so. And
Yeah.
to see those kinds of rumors then even spread further by figures like Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, that's very discouraging to me, especially in a moment of crisis where so many homes and livelihoods and lives were lost or destroyed. And to see like that kind of calculation be made is very frustrating. I can't say it necessarily surprised me, but it definitely, I think I do a lot of work. We see a lot of terrible things on the internet. But that one, I think, was very frustrating to see it connected. And, when you see these maps of like, oh, look, it exclusively went through Republican zones, and like, look at the map of the hurricane juxtaposed against this electoral map, which are kind of like these faux pieces of evidence that are insinuating something that is very frustrating to see, I'd say. And the rumors that came out generally in that disaster moment, I'd say, yeah, lots of conspiracy theories there.
And just given our current media diet with regards to how we consume social media and we move from one subject to the next, how much of a half-life does a rumor like that have? Have we already moved on from it? Or is it something that will remain and be part of people's thinking as they make their choices for the election?
I think more broadly, it contributes to a narrative that the election is somehow rigged or stolen by nefarious forces. But it also reminds us, I'd say, more importantly, that sometimes saying crazy things on the internet gives you attention. So people ask me all the time, do folks like this actually believe in what they're saying? I think they believe enough that it's going to get headlines in news outlets to say, oh yes, this representative said this crazy thing, quote unquote. But I also want to take an empathetic approach here, that there are natural disasters or occurrences that feel other very um like new or devastating or natural, and we're looking for explanations. And part of the collective sense making process, part of the rumoring process, is trying to get an explanation where uh, a fast one isn't necessarily there initially. The truth travels slower than social media. So I empathize with the desires to look to alternative kind of epistemic frames, epistemology meaning like a way of knowing reality, right? Like I'm a person of faith, and sometimes there are certain things I can't describe in this life using reason or rationality, and it sort of feels like I might rely on, you know, other kinds of informations or explanations for reality. And I think like that is something that we need to bear in mind in these highly uncertain times, that folks will lean back on when there aren't fast enough explanations, or they're not satisfied with the explanations that they're getting.
I think that's very true. I think if we have to qualify these times, it's one of complexity and high anxiety. And that word sense making is really important, that we're doing our best, each of us trying to make sense of this particular time, which is so unusual. And if we can't find the facts, we fill them in with something else. And so I think that's worth bearing in mind as we think about the integrity and perceptions around trust of the electoral system. Claire, I hesitate to do this to you because we've spoken so much about the ballot initiatives. Oh, actually, there's a new question because I'm going to avoid the ballot initiative question for now. But for a journalist, how exciting or frustrating are post-election vote drops that come in day by day?
Hmm. Yeah, it all depends on the context. Like if the results are really close and the contest could have like a huge impact on our state, I'd say I'm like a little more glued to my screen. But if the margins are really wide and it's unlikely that one candidate or one issue is going to make up the difference, I'm a little more focused on other work.
Yeah, I think that's fair, and it's so interesting to have this information sort of peter in like that. I think I'll just maybe the last question to you, Danielle, and this is something that we had discussed earlier before we began this program about whether Washington State truly can serve as a bellwether for the rest of the country. And I don't know whether we can say that in terms of political outcomes because it's not perceived as a swing state, but is there something about our region that is indicative of where the rest of the country is or might head because we do things differently or we adopt things differently or earlier, or there's something in demographically that's happening here or that might indicate it will happen elsewhere. I know that we're here, you know, on the far left-hand side of the continent, and it feels like we're so far away from the other systems of power in this country, but there is influence that comes from Washington State from time to time. Anything bellwethery about the weather in Washington State?
I, you know, it is an interesting question. I'm definitely more in the rumor side of things than perhaps super forecasting, right? And there's a whole field of study if you're interested in folks who have called the election or certain counties that have gone with the election. And I do recall there was a county in the Pacific Northwest, I believe here in Washington State, someone can fact check me on it, that has repeatedly gone by. And what I mean by super forecasting, it like every year for decades has voted for who has become president. So, and there's so many different predictors for that. I can't necessarily say one way or another, like that it's showing something about like how the rest of the country will move. But I do know that there are a couple of these there is a super forecaster county up here that I believe the Seattle Times might have actually reported on it, but I will be fact checked on that. I don't know.
Claire, is there a
Yeah,
super, is there indicative county in Washington State?
yeah, Clallam County, on the peninsula, interestingly, has, as Danielle said, sort of gone with the tide every 4 years. So once again, will be interesting to see if it goes the same way as nationally.
Okay. Well, I think we'll leave it there. You both have been incredibly, um, I wouldn't say good sports, but this has been a tough conversation to have. We're dealing with fresh data as it came in over the last few days, and you've really helped make sense of it for our audience and for me. And I think you've both been voices of reason. And I feel a little bit more calm, at least in Washington State, about the level of faith and trust in our electoral system. And the next 2 weeks will certainly be very interesting. So thank you both for just being playing such an instrumental role in making sense of what can be an anxious, complex time.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
And thank you all for joining us for this really special, timely event. And I hope you have a good rest of the evening.
Thank you from UW Impact as well. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Hanson. If you're interested in trust and this topic of trust, please consider joining Arts and Sciences and the Evans School at Town Hall on November 7th. They have an event with 3 Washington secretaries of state, our current Secretary of State and 2 former ones, to talk about trust on the ballot. So that is November 7th at Town Hall. You might consider joining for that. Another huge thanks to Hanson, our very skilled moderator, Danielle and Claire, and thank you very much to our audience. This is UW Impact signing off. Thank you very much for being with us.